Would you blindly trust the person you love? Would you believe her if she said you committed a crime, even if you don't remember anything? Now, imagine being ripped from your home in the middle of the night, handcuffed in front of your neighbors, judged by society before even stepping foot in a courtroom. No evidence, no witnesses, just an accusation. The voice of the only person who should be by your side turning into your worst sentence. This is the story of Marcos, a man who saw his life destroyed by the woman he loved most. Juliana and he had a perfect marriage, a peaceful life, a promising future. But from one day to the next, everything turned into a nightmare. With a single sentence, she signed her conviction. The police didn't hesitate. The justice system didn't question it. All it took was one word, a tearful statement, and Marcos's freedom was snatched away with no chance of defense. But the scariest thing, Juliana was sure she was telling the truth. Time passed. The days turned into years, and Marcos rotted behind bars, carrying a crime he never committed. Meanwhile, Juliana was haunted by a growing doubt. Something about the story didn't make sense. Little details began to emerge, bits of truth that she had ignored for so long. And then, reality hit her like a brutal blow. She had made the biggest mistake of her life, but when the truth finally came out, it was too late. How many lives have been destroyed by a single lie? Marcos lost everything: his freedom, his dignity, his chance to prove the truth. And when Juliana realized her mistake, there was no turning back. But he wasn't the only one. There are more innocent people living this nightmare now, and they need to be heard. If this story outrages you, leave a like now and subscribe to the channel. Here we tell the truths that the system tries to hide, and you can't stay out of this fight. For 8 years, Marcos and Juliana shared a life that seemed like something out of a fairy tale. A solid marriage built on love, trust, and complicity. Friends admired them, family saw them as an example, and for Marcos himself, there was no doubt. He had found his partner for life. But what he didn't know was that little by little, the woman who slept next to him was changing. Small details, once insignificant, began to transform into something darker. The lost look, the prolonged silences, the evasive answers. Something was wrong. At first, Marcos tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just the stress of work, a difficult period, some worry that she didn't yet feel confident in sharing. But the distance between the two grew every day. The kisses became colder. The conversations became shorter. The sleepless nights became frequent. Marcos was still trying to keep his marriage on track, but he felt that somehow he lost his wife to something invisible, something he couldn't understand. And then came the questions. Juliana began to question him about his routine, his schedule, his friends. The woman who had never shown jealousy suddenly seemed obsessed with where he was, who he talked to, what he did when he wasn't home. But these were not ordinary questions. They were filled with a tone of distrust, with insinuations that Marcos did not understand. It was as if she was searching for something, some proof of something he didn't even know he needed to defend himself against. The atmosphere inside the house changed completely. Juliana no longer smiled like she used to. He avoided. Marcos refused his touch, but at the same time he seemed to watch him every moment. Small arguments started to become frequent, arguments about things that had never been a problem before. Suddenly, the man she loved was someone she feared, and Marcos, without understanding why, saw his life begin to turn into a silent nightmare. But he didn't know that Juliana wasn't alone in this. Someone very close was whispering in his ears, fueling his doubts, planting seeds of fear in his mind. And before Marcos could realize it, his wife no longer saw the truth, just the lie they made her believe. The night was silent when Marcos was awakened by the sound of heavy knocking on the door. His heart instantly sped up. Still a little drowsy, he tried to understand what was happening. He looked to the side and saw Juliana sitting on the edge of the bed, her face pale, her eyes teary, and her hands shaking. Before he could ask, The knocking sound became even louder, followed by a firm voice on the other. "Enter police, open the door immediately." The instinct was to get up, but Juliana held his arm tightly, her gaze fixed on him as if she was seeing a stranger. "I'm sorry," was all she could whisper before letting go of his hand and looking away. Confused, Marcos walked to the door, and when he opened it, he found at least 4 armed police officers, lights flashing on the street, neighbors peering through the windows. Before he could say a word, he was brutally grabbed, pushed against the wall, and handcuffed like a dangerous criminal. "You're under arrest," said one of the officers. The shock was immediate. For what? What's going on? He tried to struggle, tried to understand, but the only response he received was the hard gaze of the police officers and the cold voice of one of them ordering him to remain silent. As he was dragged out of the house, he saw Juliana standing at the door with her arms crossed and her eyes full of tears. But she didn't do anything. I didn't say anything, just watched. Outside, cell phone camera flashes illuminated his face. The entire neighborhood seemed to have woken up to see the scene. "I didn't do anything. This is a mistake," Marcos shouted, but no one seemed interested in hearing his version. He tried to look at Juliana, waiting for her to say something, to deny that nonsense. But she remained motionless, guilt written all over her expression. The car left, and as Marcos stared at the bars that separated him from the outside world, he desperately tried to put the pieces of the puzzle together. What the hell was going on? He never did anything to deserve this. He never raised his voice. He never hurt anyone. He was an ordinary man with an ordinary life. And now he was here, being treated like a monster. The answers came only hours later in the cold room of the police station. The officer in front of him opened a folder, took out some pages, and with an indifferent look, said the words that froze Marcos's blood. "Your wife reported you. She said you committed a horrible crime against someone in your family." The ground seemed to disappear beneath his feet. The air became heavy, difficult to breathe. Juliana? The woman he shared his life with? The accusation was absurd, unthinkable, impossible, but there he was, handcuffed in front of police officers who had already judged him guilty even before any investigation. And the worst of all, there was no evidence, nothing, just her word. And that, for justice, was enough. The Marcos trial was not a process in search of the truth. It was a spectacle. From the moment his name appeared in the newspapers, he was no longer an ordinary man, no longer an unjustly accused husband. He was a villain, a monster in the headlines, condemned by public opinion before even stepping foot in court. And this invisible condemnation weighed on him much more than the handcuffs that held him that night. The media fueled hate. Cruel husband betrayed the trust of his own family, the face of wickedness. No headlines questioned the accusations. No one wondered if there might be a mistake. It didn't matter that there wasn't a single concrete proof. It didn't matter that Juliana's accusation was built on nothing but words. The public wanted blood. And when society demands someone to blame, justice often rushes to deliver one. In court, Marcos tried to remain calm. He knew that all of this was absurd, that the facts would soon be clarified. How could someone be convicted without evidence? How could an entire life be destroyed just based on words? But as the trial progressed, he realized he was alone. His lawyer fought, presented arguments, demanded proof, but it was like shouting in an empty room. Nobody wanted to listen. The prosecutor painted a dark, emotionally charged story. He didn't need proof, he just needed the perfect narrative. He told the jury how Marcos deceived everyone for years, how he was a manipulative man who hid his true nature. Every look in the courtroom carried contempt. This was no longer a trial. It was a modern-day lynching. And Juliana was there, sitting in the front row. The haggard face, the swollen eyes. She couldn't face him. Perhaps, at that moment, he began to realize that he had made a mistake. But the process had already gone too far. There was no turning back. When it came time for the verdict, Marcos felt time slow down. His heart hammered in his chest. He looked around, looking for a single look that reflected doubt, that showed that someone there was seeing the truth. But all he found were cold expressions, convinced of their guilt. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Then the judge lifted the paper and read the words that would seal Marcos's fate. Guilty. For a moment, Marcos felt like he wasn't there anymore. The sound of the judge's words echoed distantly, as if his body no longer belonged to him. He looked around, looking for any sign that this was a nightmare he would wake up from at any moment. But all he found were cold expressions, eyes that showed no empathy. His knees weakened, and cold sweat ran down the back of his neck. The urge to scream caught in his throat, suffocated by the overwhelming feeling of helplessness. It wasn't just their freedom that was being ripped away. It was their identity, their history, their dignity. The feeling of being treated like a disposable object by the system was a blow stronger than any handcuff. The sound exploded in the room like thunder. Marcos felt the world crumble around him. He wanted to scream, he wanted to protest, he wanted to beg for more time, for more investigation, for any chance to prove his innocence. But it was too late. The judge's gavel banged, and his sentence was set. Condemned. The room exploded with reactions. Some celebrated, others just murmured, satisfied with the outcome. For them, justice had been done. For Marcos, that was the moment his life truly ended. He was taken out of the courtroom without being able to look back, without even having the chance to see if Juliana was sorry. But at that moment, nothing else mattered. How many more lives will need to be destroyed before justice truly works? Marcos was convicted without evidence, without witnesses, without the right to the truth, just based on words. But what if it were you? If your freedom depended on a jury that already decided your guilt even before the trial? Does that scare you? Does that revolt you? Comment no proof, no justice, and tell me, should a simple accusation be enough to end someone's life? The iron gate closed with a bang that echoed in Marcos's mind like a harbinger of the hell he was about to face. From that moment on, he was no longer a man. It was no longer Marcos. He was just a number, a prisoner, a convict marked by the most despicable accusation anyone could carry. And inside the prison, where the law is written in hate and blood, this was a sentence worse than death itself. From day one, Marcos felt the weight of injustice in a way he never imagined possible. The guard's gaze was cold, full of contempt, as if he wasn't even worthy of stepping on that filthy ground. The other inmates whispered as they saw him pass, and soon the whispers turned to threats. Monster! Coward! You deserve to rot here. No chance of defense. No opportunity to explain. Inside those cells, he had already been tried again, and this time there wasn't even a judge to bring. Down the gavel. The first attack came in the cafeteria. A sudden push, a tray flying away, the sharp thud of a punch that made him fall to the dirty floor. Laughter echoed around him, mixed with insults. He tried to get up, but another blow knocked him back to the ground. Inside, he wasn't just a prisoner, it was a target. The days dragged on in a routine of violence and humiliation. In the shower, boiling water was thrown on his back. In the courtyard, gazes as sharp as blades, just waiting for an opportunity to attack him. In the corridors, pushing, punching, teasing. And in his cell, the deafening silence of loneliness. Nobody wanted to be near him. But the worst part wasn't the physical pain. What really destroyed him was abandonment. He was forgotten by the world. No letter, no visits, no voice from outside saying they still believed in him. Time became his worst enemy. Each day that passed without news of the outside world was a cruel reminder that her existence had been erased. In the first few months, I still hoped to hear his name during visiting calls, but he soon realized that no one would come. Nobody. He had died to the world, and the world had moved on without him. The silence of the early morning was the most torturous. Lying on the thin, dirty mattress, he stared at the ceiling, listening to the muffled screams of the other inmates, trying not to drown in his own thoughts. Marcos wondered if anyone still remembered him, if Juliana, even for a second, thought about everything he was going through. But the truth was simple and cruel. He was completely alone. His family moved away, his friends disappeared. Even Juliana, the woman who put him there, never tried to see him again. It was as if he were already dead. Marcos's mind began to give way. The weight of time, despair, hopelessness, everything accumulated inside him like a bomb ready to explode. He wondered if someone, somewhere, was still saying his name. If only a newspaper would mention his story when it all came to an end. But he knew the answer. Outside, the world continued to spin, indifferent to his suffering. To the system, he was just another number in the statistics. For his former friends, it's a closed case. And for Juliana, he wondered if she slept peacefully at night, if she still thought about him, or if his guilt had dissolved into the comfort of freedom he would never have again. He wondered how much longer he could hold out, if there was still any point in fighting. But something inside him, an almost invisible thread of resistance, kept him from giving up. He knew he was innocent, and if the world had forgotten his truth, he refused to forget. Every night, alone in that cold cell, Marcos repeated to himself, "It can't end like this. Someone, somewhere is going to see the truth. Someone is going to listen." But how long could he maintain this hope? What if, in the end, no one was ever willing to listen? Time passed, but guilt did not. Juliana tried to move on with her life, but something inside her screamed, an invisible weight that suffocated her every time she looked at her own reflection in the mirror. She got what she wanted. Marcos was far away. But then, why didn't I feel relief? Why did the feeling that something was wrong grow within her with each passing day? At first, she tried to ignore it. He clung to the idea that he had done the right thing, but doubts began to creep into his mind, like cracks in a wall that once seemed unbreakable. Little details that didn't make sense. Why did Marcos never really try to defend himself? Why, instead of anger, did he only show despair and disbelief? What if she was wrong? These questions began to haunt her. During the nights, she tossed and turned in bed, trying to remember every moment, every word, every sensation that led her to accuse her own husband. And that's when he realized his memories weren't as clear as he thought. Some things felt forced, implanted in her mind by someone she trusted blindly. But who? Then she remembered him. Carlos, her older brother, the only one who was always by her side, the one who held her in his arms the day she made the complaint, the same one who repeated countless times that she needed to be strong, that Marcos didn't deserve her compassion, the same as convinced her that remembering was too painful and that she should trust what he said. Juliana's heart raced. How did she not realize this before? The weight of the discovery crushed his shoulders. His body was shaking, the air felt thin. Juliana put her hands on her head, trying to reverse the thoughts that were now unfolding uncontrollably. Carlos, the man she had always admired, who had been by her side through all her difficult times, now revealed himself to be her biggest nightmare. How could she be so blind? How did she allow him to manipulate her so easily? Every scene of her life with Marcos came back in flashes, now tinged with a macabre tone. She saw the details she ignored, the signs she chose not to see. And now Marcos was paying with his own life. His chest burned, his mind screamed. She needed to hurry, needed to correct her mistake before it was too late. But deep down, something inside her was already whispering the truth. Maybe it already was. From the beginning, Carlos was present in every step, in every decision, in every word that made her destroy Marcos's life. Something inside her screamed that she needed to know more, needed to understand what really happened that fateful night. Driven by uncontrollable restlessness, Juliana began to mentally retrace every conversation, every piece of advice, every sentence he whispered when she was too fragile to question. And the more I thought, the more I realized that the pieces didn't fit together. Carlos knew too much. He knew things she never said out loud. And even worse, some of this information simply they couldn't be true. It was then that the penny dropped. Juliana felt her stomach turn, her breathing quicken, her hands go cold. She couldn't believe what her mind was beginning to form. What if Marcos had never done anything? What if it was all just a carefully constructed lie? Panic took over his body. If that were true, if she had made such a terrible mistake, then it meant that the man she loved was rotting in prison for something that never happened. It meant that Carlos used it. And worst of all, it meant that the real culprit was still free. Juliana's blood ran cold. Her body shook, and a deep nausea overcame her as the truth finally revealed itself before her. Carlos, the brother she trusted blindly, the man who always protected her, who guided her through her darkest moments. He was the real culprit. It was as if a movie was playing in her mind at top speed. Every conversation, every look, every touch on the shoulder he gave her as he said, "You need to be strong." But he didn't want her to be strong. He wanted her to be blind. He fed her false memories, implanted fear in her head, distorted her vision until she could no longer trust even herself, and she fell. Juliana felt her chest tighten, her breathing ragged. What had she done? The man she loved, who shared her life, who shared his dreams with her. Marcos was arrested, and now she knew it was innocent. His heart was beating wildly, his hands were shaking as he picked up the phone. She needed to fix this. I needed to tell the truth, but deep down, something inside her already knew it was too late. The first call was to the police station. His voice was shaky, stumbling over words, trying to explain that everything had been a mistake. But on the other end of the line, the answer came dryly, indifferently. "If you have something to say, come and formalize your statement." The weight of the system was greater than its urgency. Juliana didn't wait. He took the keys, drove too fast, saw nothing but the guilt that burned inside his chest. He entered the police station like someone breaking into a fire, trying to save someone who was already on fire. "I lied. Everything was a mistake. You need to release Marcos." But the police officer's eyes showed no surprise, just tiredness. How many times have they heard stories like this? How many times has a late repentance tried to reverse a definitive conviction? One of the officers sighed before responding, "The case has already been tried. You need much more than words now." And then came the final blow. Marcos was no longer alive. Juliana's world collapsed in an instant. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. His eyes glazed over, as if his mind refused to process the information. No, it couldn't be true. Her body weakened, and she had to lean on the wall to keep from falling. The policeman continued talking, but the words were just distant noises. Marcos was dead, dead. The truth pierced his soul like a sharp blade. There was nothing more she could do. No confession, no apology, no attempt at justice could bring him back. Juliana began to sob uncontrollably, her body shaking with each desperate breath. She tried to hold on to any shred of hope, but all she found was emptiness. She destroyed Marcos's life, and now nothing could fix it. The floor seemed to disappear. The air was knocked from his lungs. The entire world spun around her, but she could no longer move. The policeman's voice continued to explain the details. An attack in prison, a fight that ended fatally, a body found in the courtyard. But Juliana didn't hear anything else. It was too late. She fell to her knees right there in the middle of the police station, her hands on her face, despair overflowing. The truth had finally been told, but there was no one to hear her anymore. What's more cruel, being convicted of a crime you didn't commit or being acquitted when it's too late? Marcos lost everything, his freedom, his dignity, and in the end, his life. All because someone decided to play with the truth, while the system chose to condemn first and investigate later. Now I ask you, Juliana deserves forgiveness, or are some choices unforgivable? Comment, late justice is injustice. and say, what should her sentence be? The world around Juliana seemed distant, as if she were trapped in a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. The policeman's voice became a muffled noise in his ears, the words echoing in fragments. Marcos. He couldn't resist. The ground disappeared beneath his feet. His body felt heavy, his chest compressed as if someone had knocked the air from his lungs. Everything was spinning. Time suddenly seemed to no longer make sense. It was too late. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out of her mouth. I wanted to run to him, hold him, ask for forgiveness, beg him to come back. But all that was left was an empty cell and a name scratched from the records. Marcos did not have time to prove his innocence. He didn't have time to look her in the eyes and tell her that he forgave her, or that he would never forgive her. The truth came, but it did not come to set him free, came to bury him. Juliana fell to her knees on the cold floor of the police station, tears burning her skin, her nails digging into her own face in a despair that no words could describe. What had she done? She took everything from him. Not just freedom, but hope. The chance to rebuild your life, the chance to fight. All this time, Marcos waited. He waited for someone to believe him. He hoped she believed him. But the only person who could have prevented this was the same person who condemned him. The next few days were a blur. The news of Marcos's death was leaked to the media. The same newspapers that had previously printed headlines calling him a monster now published empty sentences about an irreparable error. Lawyers discussed whether the sentence should be annulled posthumously. Politicians gave speeches about the need to overhaul the judicial system. But none of that mattered. Not for him, not for Juliana. She spent sleepless nights reading and rereading the articles, trying to find, among the cold and calculated words, something that brought comfort. But all I saw were numbers. Another innocent person convicted. Another wasted life. No headline said the essential thing. Marcos was murdered. Not by a knife or a gun, but by the system. For the lies, for the rush to blame someone. Juliana went to the funeral, but didn't have the courage to approach the coffin. I knew I didn't deserve to be there. I felt the looks, the whispers, the silent judgment of the few people who still cared about Marcos. She killed that man without ever laying a finger on him. Now he would have to carry this weight for the rest of his life, and there was no worse prison than that. The weight of guilt never lessened. Juliana spent nights staring at the ceiling, feeling emptiness consume her soul. Every object in the house seemed to scream the truth she tried to ignore. The smell of coffee in the morning, the dusty old photos, the ring still tucked away in a drawer. It was all a suffocating reminder that she destroyed the only man who ever truly loved her. Sometimes he closed his eyes and imagined Marcos's voice, saying his name as he did before. But the only thing I heard was silence. And that silence killed her a little more every day. Marcos's face haunted her in every reflection, in every dream, in every silence that took over the house where they were once happy. But now there was no more happiness. There was nothing else. Just a name she destroyed and a life that could never be restored. She tried to make sense of the chaos she created. I needed to do something. I needed to fix what was still possible. He began giving interviews, appearing on camera with sunken eyes and a trembling voice, telling the truth, admitting his mistake, begging for Marcos's name to be cleared. But words were never enough. The society that once demanded her condemnation now simply ignored her, because to the world, Marcos was already dead, and dead people don't need justice. The newspapers that had previously highlighted his guilt now treated the story as an unfortunate error, an isolated case, a failure in the system. But no one was held accountable. No judge paid for having convicted him without evidence. No police officer lost their position for ignoring inconsistencies. No prosecutor recanted because they distorted the facts. Time passed, and the Marcos tragedy became just another statistic. Carlos, the real culprit, remained free. Juliana tried to confront him, but he never showed remorse. His eyes didn't waver. No hesitation, no trace of regret, just a cold, calculated smile, as if everything had gone exactly as planned. "You were always naive, Juliana," he murmured, crossing his arms. "You believed what I wanted you to believe, and now, well, now it's too late." Juliana's stomach turned. How did she not see this before? How did she blindly trust the man who in the end destroyed not only Marcos's life, but hers as well? "I did what I needed to do," he said, with the coldness of someone who knew he would never pay for the crime he committed. "You believed in me because you wanted to." Those words were the last thing she heard before he disappeared from her life. With no evidence, no witnesses, no one to accuse him, Carlos was untouchable. And Juliana? She was just the woman who killed her own husband with a lie. The house where he lived with Marcos became unbearable. Every wall held the memory of the man she destroyed. Neighbors avoided looking her in the eye. Family members moved away. Not because they didn't feel sorry, but because no one knew what to say to someone carrying a weight like that. She was not a victim. She wasn't just guilty either. He was a living mistake, walking among the wreckage of a life that could never be rebuilt. Years passed, but Juliana never forgave herself. He never found redemption. Because the cruelest truth wasn't just that Marcos had died for a crime he didn't commit. The truth was nobody cared. His name would be forgotten. His face would disappear from the headlines. And what would be left? Just a deafening silence and a guilt that would never leave her. Time passed, but the pain never dissipated. Juliana learned to live with the weight of her mistakes, but never found peace. The world moved on, as it always does, and Marcos's story became just another lost case in the system's files, a forgotten name in a process marred by haste, negligence, and the blind desire to find someone to blame. But for her, time has healed nothing. She no longer recognized herself. The marks of guilt were on her face, in the empty eyes that reflected the woman she had become. At every corner I saw ghosts. In every crowd he looked for a face he would never see again. In each silence, I heard the last word that Marcos shouted before being taken away by the police. "Please believe me." But she didn't believe it. She trusted the lie. And now, what was left? The truth came, but it came too late. How many other Marcos would be in prison now, hoping someone would see the truth before it was too late? How many lives were being destroyed at this very moment by unfounded accusations, by a system that condemns first and asks questions later? Regret was a poison that Juliana drank every day, but there was no antidote. She could scream to the world that she was wrong. She could spend the rest of her life trying to clear Marcos's name, but none of that would bring him back, because the worst miscarriage of justice isn't convicting an innocent person. It's never giving them the chance to prove their innocence. And Juliana? She would continue living, but not like before, because some truths are too cruel to forget, and some guilt can never be erased. Marcos lost everything: his freedom, his dignity, and, in the end, his life. All because someone played with the truth, and the system preferred to believe in words, not evidence. Juliana realized too late, but her mistake cost more than any apology could repair. If this story revolts you, leave a like and share. More people need to know how much a lie can destroy a life. Subscribe to the Wrongfully Convicted channel and turn on notifications, because here buried truths come to light. And if you thought this case was unfair, the next one is even worse. A fatal error, a sealed fate, a truth that should never have been discovered. Get ready. This next video could change everything you believe about justice.